Hi, welcome back to the second half of the non-disclosure agreement discussion. In this video, we'll do a deep dive and go over each of the sections of the NDA in detail. A few things I want to note. This video is tailored to a specific NDA that you will be drafting in this website. This NDA has been reviewed by several attorneys and gets used in real transactions, and this NDA is designed for ordinary course business transactions like hiring employees or freelancers, but it's not for mergers and acquisitions. Typically, businesses don't do M&A deals in a do-it-yourself context. So I just want to point that out because M&A NDAs have more bells and whistles than this agreement. And there are certain things like exclusivity provisions, which grants exclusive right to negotiate and discuss the potential acquisition with the recipient party. Something like that is not built in here. Let's head over to the platform. Please make sure that you are watching this video on high definition so you can actually see the text. If you're not on HD, the text might look blurry. Here I'm on the professional view of the document automation application. You might have simplified view, which will look like this. And in that case, if you want to look at the actual text of the agreement, then you can either export it out or press this preview button. I'm going to be using the professional view for this video so that it uses the right amount of screen real estate. But just to give you a quick overview of the layout, on the left hand is the input items. The middle screen shows you the actual agreement, and the right column shows you the help text. In the first video, I stressed the point that whether you sign a mutual or unilateral NDA has far-reaching consequences. You'll notice that in this form, it conveniently tells you which it is at the in the title of the document. But in most cases, you'll not be that lucky. It'll just say non-disclosure agreement in the title, and that's it. And you have to figure it out. So how do you figure it out? You can usually tell by how the terms are defined. If the document is unilateral, then the defined terms, disclosing party or receiving party, will be hardwired to the actual entity, so it'll be defined right after naming of the party. Here, the customer is the disclosing party, and the vendor is the receiving party. In our company's form document, our company's legal name is the default text in this field. And if the document is mutual, let me show you here. It says each party may disclose, and in that case, the party disclosing becomes the disclosing party, and whichever is the other party becomes the receiving party. So it's flexible. It changes based on the context of who's speaking and who's listening at any given moment. Another neat feature is that if you go to the red line mode, it shows you how unilateral has changed to become the mutual agreement. You'll see that most of the changes occur early in the document where parties are defined, but later in the later part, the receiving party's obligations and restrictions in the unilateral agreement becomes that of both parties in the mutual version. After the preamble, where the parties are defined, next comes the definition of confidential information. Notice that confidential information is defined to include information that was disclosed by or for a disclosing party. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the disclosing party itself that discloses. It could be one of its agents, like their lawyers. And the information doesn't need to be received by the receiving party either. It could be one of their agents too. And like I discussed in the first video, the definition starts out as all non-public information and includes a ton of examples in the definition. This part here, that is marked or otherwise identified as proprietary or confidential at the time of disclosure, means that if you mark a written document as confidential, or if it's oral communication, you say that it is confidential, it is obviously protected. And this part here is the negotiated point, or that by its nature would be understood by a reasonable person to be proprietary or confidential. This is the language that protects confidential information even if you don't mark it or identify it. This language makes it more favorable to the disclosing party by making it more forgiving for the disclosing party at the expense of making life a little bit more difficult for the receiving party, because now something that's not even marked as confidential could be confidential, and you could get into trouble if you disclose it. If the receiving party pushes back and says we need all confidential information to be marked because we enter into way too many contracts like this and we can't keep track of them all, if you want to accommodate that position, then you would have to delete this language. But if you do delete this language, you would have to be vigilant in marking or identifying every confidential information. Otherwise, if you forget, having that signed NDA will not help you because whatever you forget doesn't count as confidential information. This brings up the point that it's not just the lawyers who need to understand the documents, it's also the people who use the documents. They need to understand what it says. Even if a lawyer negotiates this document, that person isn't going to check all outgoing email attachments to see if it's properly marked or not. All too often, people just think that once you sign it, it's a done deal. But all a signed contract does is to set the rules, but you still have to follow through with those rules to receive the benefits of the contract. Now, having said that, I like to leave this language in, even if our company is on the recipient side, because I think it's a bit less stressful for the other side, and letting your customers win from time to time is not such a bad idea either. You don't have to win every point to have a good outcome. In fact, you could lose a ton of legal points, but if the dollar value of the contract is high enough, it might still end up being an excellent transaction for the company. Going back to the document, the final part of the definition section specifies the exclusions. Now, what happens if there's a conflict between the two? Say it's a confidential information, it was clearly marked, but also falls into one of these enumerated cases. In that case, explicit exclusion wins. So for example, you provide the receiving party confidential information that has a lot of graphs and charts, and you include one of those charts in a PowerPoint slide that you present at a conference. And under Clause C, it becomes generally known to the public without violation of this agreement by the receiving party. Under that clause, you probably would lose confidential treatment of information captured in that chart. Next part is restrictions. This section states that you can't use information for purposes other than permitted purposes. And permitted purposes is defined at the top to explore the possibility of a business relationship in respect of blah, which is whatever you fill in this blank. So for example, if you were given access to the source code as a vendor, you can use it to review how much it would take to develop a feature or give an estimate, but you wouldn't be allowed to copy it and paste it for other projects. I'm not going to read every single one, but just to highlight a few things. Obviously, you're not allowed to exploit the information or reverse engineer it. And the fact that this non-disclosure relationship is taking place is also confidential unless otherwise agreed. And finally, you are responsible for any breach, not just for yourself, but also for your employees and agents as well. Section 3 deals with compelled disclosures, which is typically when the government is trying to obtain documents through a subpoena or something. Typically, you're required to let the disclosing party know, and in this document requires the recipient to cooperate to protect the information. So a good example might be President Donald Trump's tax returns and financial records. His lenders and his accountants have this information, but they didn't just hand over the documents as soon as the prosecutors came knocking. Now, there might be some overlap with professional obligations to keep confidences with accountants, but lenders, not so much. But in any case, the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the president lost there in 2020. But you could see how some institutions might not want to find themselves in this middle of a long, protracted legal battle. Section 4 deals with the fact that the confidential information might not be accurate. This protects the disclosing party from being sued for information they provide. Um, but wait a minute, what if they lie? So for example, to get inflated pricing or something. Now, if they enter into a more definitive agreement, like an acquisition agreement, those agreements will contain something called representations, which will protect the buyer from misrepresentations. But at the NDA stage, something like that is not typically built in. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't sue, because you can still sue under a different legal theory like fraud, but which is a different animal than a breach of contract. Now, I'm not going to go into the details here, but I do want to point out one thing, which is that one of the requirements of proving fraud is justifiable reliance on the misrepresentation to their detriment. But this section 4 here stands to frustrate that line of argument by essentially saying, hey, I told you not to rely on this information because we won't be held responsible for it. And this section also covers other points like the improvement to the idea belongs to the disclosing party, and there's no expectation to enter into a future transaction just because we signed the NDA. Section 5 deals with the duration of the contract. In this contract, it is structured as earlier of two things. It could be some sort of an anniversary. Here, the default value is 2 years, or entering into a definitive agreement about the permitted purpose. This is what I meant by NDAs being a preliminary document that lays out the groundwork and later gets superseded by a real transaction agreement. But you can't just assume that it will be there, because oftentimes an organization might have an NDA that's drafted by one law firm, but the definitive agreement is drafted by another law firm, and they don't know what each other contains. So you need to actually make sure that the definitive agreement does in fact contain a confidentiality provision in there, or incorporates it by reference. When I first heard incorporate by reference as a junior lawyer, I was like, what is that? Incorporation by reference is best described as sort of a legal equivalent of copying and pasting, or better yet, sort of a hyperlinking in websites. So definitive agreement will say something to the fact that the NDA, dated some date between party A and party B, is hereby incorporated by reference and made part of this agreement as if set forth in full. And this proviso here comes after the semicolon, is a language that protects trade secrets indefinitely. I stressed the importance of this language very strongly in the first video. And the last sentence here provides that the disclosing party has the right to get back the confidential information or have it destroyed. Section 6 covers what happens when there is a breach. It leaves it open-ended, but it specifically allows for money damages and also injunctions, which means that you could ask a court to have the breaching party to stop doing something like selling a product that they stole from you. I've seen instances where people really want to make the document scary and have scary consequences. So they'll say something like, parties agree that each violation is worth $1 million in damages. But something like that, I don't think is typical, and I actually think that it's generally frowned upon. Section 7 is relevant if you are using some cloud or some other data repository service to share information. Oftentimes, they'll have a click-through acknowledgement, which can sometimes conflict with this document, and this clause makes sure that this NDA doesn't get accidentally overwritten by a click-through term of service. This last section essentially is a collection of boilerplate provisions. They're called boilerplate because they're important and keep things together. And they tend to be the same like how boilerplates were mass-produced in the past. The two things I would point out here is the state law, and the court location to choose from. This isn't an acquisition agreement, which often uses Delaware law, or loan or securities purchase agreement, which often uses New York law. Or if it were a real estate, you choose a state in which the property sits on. And then NDA is mostly for convenient purposes, and typically it's where the business is located. But it could make it inconvenient for the other party, and could be a negotiating point. And the second point is that in the unilateral agreement, the receiving party pays for the disclosing party's legal bills, because disclosing party doesn't have any restrictions in the unilateral setting and doesn't have anything to breach. In the mutual agreement, though, the losing party pays for the prevailing party's legal bills. The default rule in the United States is to pay for your own lawyers, but by having this clause, it changes that default rule. It has the potential to level the playing field for the little guy, but you could end up on the wrong side of the bargain as well. The last thing I want to cover is, let's say you've signed an NDA as a recipient party, and you're under the obligation to keep silent, and you need to discuss something about the transaction with other people, like your future clients. Now, how would you do it? Of course, the easiest way is to say nothing, you don't know anything about it. But if you are a consultant, you might be asked whether you've seen something like this before, and be asked about your opinion. In that case, what I've seen other people do is to anonymize the parties, make sure that they can't infer it, and provide the information in general terms without any specifics like names, dates, and amounts. Use words like significant or substantial to describe the amount. In other words, sort of abstract out the details. So that just about wraps it up. I hope this information was helpful. And if you have any questions or any other documents that you would like a deep dive on, please feel free to reach out or comment below. Thank you very much.